to see the sides on either side, and we see a top surface. So, we're seeing multiple surfaces. We can tell that it's a round object by the ellipse on the top, but it's seen at an angle to where that ellipse compresses or foreshortens into an ellipse, or the circle compresses into an ellipse. And so that tells us we're looking down at the object since we can see the top. We've done another ellipse at the bottom here that would be equal or a little bit broader than the top one, and that tells us we're looking down at that surface as well. And then the second main thing is using value to create the illusion of light and shadow on form. And so our light source is coming in from the right side, and it's going to hit this side, and then it's going to go into shadow on the left side. It's going to hit the top surface, but not all of the area inside of that inner tube. And then we have a cast shadow over here on the left side. So the first thing we start with is use a fairly light value. Now I've painted this surface to sort of a light middle tone value, and when you're using value, that's just much easier than starting with a white board, because the white board, in the end, very little of it is going to be white, so you're kind of starting with this surface that you're having to really do a lot to get it into the values you need. And if you start in the middle, it's a little easier to kind of get there. And since we're talking about the light, I'm going to go ahead and start with not quite white, but a fairly light value. And I'm going to, kind of estimate that the light source hits the object the most directly right about here. And so I'm going to make this fairly light, almost white, not quite. And I do a fair amount of mixing on the palette. I've just always preferred to do it that way. You can mix on the surface as well. If you look here, you can see I've mixed using a Van Dyke brown, which is kind of a warm black, from white to various grays, all the way to full value with the Van Dyke brown, which is not quite as dark as black, but it's pretty dark. So having a range to start with is very useful. I'm not going to use hues in this other than that the slight chromatic neutral of the Van Dyke brown. So it's just going to be kind of a warm grays and a warm black. And, so that just limits everything to value. And color has so many other types of contrast that it's a whole other can of worms. So I'm going to limit it to this. Now the second thing I'm going to do is probably the darkest part of the object itself, and this is what we call the core shadow, and it's kind of more over here. So the light hits here the most directly, then it hits less directly at a less direct angle, and somewhere around here we get to a point where the light is no longer directly hitting this object. And so the basic shape is one of our platonic forms, the cylinder. It's a toilet paper roll, and it just adds a little bit more organic than if it were just a pure cylinder. So that's where the light first cuts out from hitting the object directly, and it's usually the darkest part of the object. And I'm not as dark as I can be, but our local value on a roll of toilet paper is quite light. So a really dark on that light local value is not going to be as dark as a dark value on, say, a black object. So I'm kind of making that edge here with this value, and I'm going to leave a little bit of space on this edge because I kind of want to indicate that as some reflected light in that area. And so there's our highlight and our core shadow, so kind of our darkest and our lightest values on this particular object. And now I'm going to get into what I call the half-light area. And so this is where light hits this rounded object, but at a less direct angle than the highlight. And so I'm going to kind of put something, over here. It's facing away from the light source, but still just getting a little bit of it. So It's a fairly dark value, but it's a little bit lighter than the core shadow. And then I think I'm going to take a little bit of that same value and put that in over here as reflected light, so a little bit lighter on the edge than the core shadow here, as though there's some light bouncing off of the ground plane and into this area. And I'll probably go back in and adjust it a little bit. And then I'll go to the next lightest gray that I've mixed up here. And so this is a part of the rounded form that's getting light at an angle, a little more direct angle than what I've just done. And let's see, so now I'm going to go to just a little bit darker than the highlight. And I think I'll take some of this over here on the edge. It's kind of turning inwards away from the light source a little bit, so it's not quite as bright. And then a transition there. So this is right next to our highlight. And so there we get the illusion of light hitting the right side and the left side going into shadow. And I'm going to go ahead and take a fairly light value, but not the brightest value, and go ahead and just kind of fill in this. And I want it to be just slightly darker than the highlight on this edge right here, but then brighter than the rest of it, the rest of the way around. Okay, and then let's take this lightest value here, mix some white in with it, pump up this highlight on the edge here. And now let's do the cardboard tube in the center of it. Quite darker local value. The white toilet paper, very light local value. This is kind of more a dark middle tone value. So the brightest part of it is going to be in the middle of our value range here. And a step darker with the very darkest part. I think I'm going to go all the way to Van Dyke brown here. And go to something not quite as dark, but pretty close. A little bit lighter. And that's kind of our three-dimensional object. To a little bit of a cast shadow there, so I'm going to go with a relatively dark value I want right here. I want it to be a little deeper object. A cast shadow is where the light from hitting another surface. And I want to get a little bit darker there. I like some reflected light there. And I think that I'm just going to kind of darken it. Area.
Kind of on this edge here.
Edges, which side of the edge is darker and which side is lighter, and make sure you get that relationship you're seeing from your subject into your painting. In traditional painting, all the information comes from your observation of the object, and you have to see things and then get those in your painting. And here we want it to be a little bit lighter next to it. You know, I didn't set myself up to keep time on this, so if this is going over the 10 minutes, just cut off here. I mean, I pretty much got the object. If not, I'm going to go ahead and finish this shadow area over here. And so in this area behind there,
And kind of along this edge, it's also
quite dark. Right in this area here too. It's a little darker than the edge of the object. I think you get the idea of using different values to get highlights where the light hits the most directly and reflects the most off, half lights where it hits less directly but directly still, and then the core shadow where it turns far enough away that it doesn't get any direct light. And then usually you will get some reflected light into the extreme edges of the shadows from light bouncing off of other surfaces. In this place, probably the ground plane that the light is hitting. And then the object blocks the light from hitting this area on the ground plane, and that's what we call a cast shadow. So by using that light logic, we get a nice illusion of a three-dimensional object reflecting light differently depending upon how the object turns relative to the light source. And combine that with linear perspective, and we start to get a pretty good illusion of three-dimensional space on what's still a very flat two-dimensional surface.